The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's orphanage slammed open, letting in the biting Chicago blizzard, and a man whose reputation was colder than the ice outside. Ryder Blackwell wasn't a man who saved people. He was the reason people needed saving. He had come to collect a blood debt, surrounded by men in heavy coats concealing illegal firearms. But amidst the terrified silence of the Grand Hall, a tiny, trembling voice cut through the heavy tension. "Are you here to pick me?" she whispered. The most feared syndicate boss in the Midwest stopped dead in his tracks, and in that singular heartbeat, the ruthless monster did something that would alter the criminal underworld forever. The air inside St. Jude's Home for Children always tasted like bleach and boiled cabbage, a sour combination that settled deep into the lungs. For 7-year-old Penelope, known to everyone simply as Penny, it was the only scent she associated with home. But St. Jude's wasn't a home, it was a waiting room, and Penny had been waiting for a very, very long time. It was the second Tuesday of December, which meant it was the Winter Gala. To the outside world of wealthy Chicago philanthropists, it was a beautiful charity event filled with warm apple cider and classical piano music. To the children of St. Jude's, it was an auction. It was the day the wealthy couples came in their tailored suits and mink coats to browse the halls, looking for a child to complete their picture-perfect lives. Penny stood in the back row of the grand parlor, her hands tightly clutching a frayed, stuffed rabbit missing its left ear. Her shoes were a size too small, pinching her toes with every shift of her weight, and her faded blue dress hung awkwardly on her painfully thin frame. She wasn't blind to the reality of her situation. She knew what the prospective parents wanted. They wanted the boisterous toddlers, the golden-haired infants, or the older boys who looked strong enough to play varsity sports. They did not want a 7-year-old girl with bruised knees, wide, haunted grey eyes, and a stutter that acted up whenever she was frightened. "Stand up straight, Penelope," hissed Mrs. Agatha Higgins, the orphanage director. Mrs. Higgins was a tall, severe woman whose smile never reached her cold, calculating eyes. Her fingers dug into Penny's shoulder like talons. "And for heaven's sake, hide that filthy toy. You look pathetic." Penny immediately shoved the rabbit behind her back, her lower lip trembling. Yes, Mrs. Higgins." Across the room, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, a wealthy couple from the Gold Coast, were kneeling in front of a bright-eyed, blonde 5-year-old named Tommy. Mrs. Harrison was crying tears of joy, brushing the boy's hair back. "He's perfect," the woman sobbed happily to her husband. "He's exactly what we've been praying for." Penny watched them with an ache in her chest so profound it made it hard to breathe. She had practiced her smile all morning in the cracked bathroom mirror. She had brushed her unruly dark hair until her scalp ached. She had even tried to stand on her tiptoes to look a little taller, a little more capable. But as the hours ticked by, the couples walked past her. Some offered a polite, pitying smile. Most simply looked right through her, as if she were a smudge on the wallpaper. By 4 in the afternoon, the grand parlor was emptying out. 7 children had been chosen. Their bags were being packed. The remaining children were quietly ushered back to their dormitories by the stern-faced staff. "Nobody picked me," Penny whispered to herself, the realization crashing down on her fragile shoulders. It wasn't the first time she had been left behind. But today the rejection stung with a finality that broke something inside her. "Of course they didn't," Mrs. Higgins snapped, overhearing the quiet murmur as she tallied up the donation checks on her clipboard. She turned to glare at the small girl. "Look at you. You skulk around in the shadows like a ghost. You don't speak up. You don't smile properly. Why would anyone want to take on a burden like you when there are perfectly normal children available? Go to the basement and sort the laundry. I don't want to look at your miserable face right now." Tears, hot and fast, pricked Penny's eyes, but she knew better than to cry in front of the director. Crying meant no dinner. She nodded silently, turning on her heel and slipping out of the grand parlor. But she didn't go to the basement. The emotional exhaustion was too heavy. Instead, Penny crept down the restricted West Wing corridor, a hallway strictly forbidden to the children. It led to Mrs. Higgins' private office. There was a small, dusty coat closet just outside the office door, where the director kept her winter overcoats. It was Penny's secret sanctuary. When the world became too loud, too cruel, or too cold, she would hide in the dark, bury her face in her rabbit, and pretend she was invisible. She slipped inside the closet, pulling the louvered door shut until only a thin sliver of light penetrated the gloom. Settling onto the floorboards among the mothball-scented coats, Penny finally let the tears fall. She hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. "I'm sorry, Barnaby," she whispered to the stuffed rabbit, her tears soaking into its worn fur. "I tried to be good. I really tried. But nobody wants us." She closed her eyes, preparing to stay hidden until the dinner bell rang. But 10 minutes later, the heavy front doors of the orphanage didn't just open. They shattered inward with a violent crash that shook the floorboards beneath Penny's hiding spot. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed down the hardwood hallway, marching with terrifying purpose. These weren't the hesitant steps of prospective parents. These were the boots of men who owned the ground they walked on. Penny froze, her breath catching in her throat. Through the slats of the closet door, she peered out into the dim hallway. A group of large men in dark tailored suits and long wool coats was storming down the corridor, heading straight for the director's office. But it was the man at the center of the formation who commanded the air in the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the predatory grace of a cornered wolf. His dark hair was swept back, and his sharp, aristocratic features were carved from stone. His eyes, even in the poor lighting, were a chilling, icy blue that promised absolute destruction. This was Ryder Blackwell. To the society pages, he was a ruthless real estate mogul. To the police and the underground, he was the undisputed king of the Chicago syndicate. He was violence wrapped in a $1,000 suit, and he looked completely enraged. "Mrs. Higgins! What?" Ryder's voice didn't need to be loud to make the walls vibrate. It was a low, lethal baritone that carried a promise of violence. The door to the director's office was kicked open before Mrs. Higgins could even answer. From her hiding spot, Penny clamped both hands over her mouth to muffle a gasp. She watched as Ryder stepped into the office, followed by a tall, scarred man named Ethan, his right hand permanently resting inside his jacket where a weapon was undoubtedly holstered. "Mr. Blackwell!" Mrs. Higgins shrieked, the sound of her chair scraping frantically against the floor as she scrambled backward. "You can't just barge in here. This is a respectable establishment." "Respectable?" Ryder scoffed, the word dripping with venom. He stepped further into the room, leaning his hands flat on her mahogany desk. "You think washing $3 million of Bratva money through a children's charity fund makes you respectable, Agatha? Did you really believe I wouldn't find out that my own territory was being used as a laundromat by my enemies?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Higgins lied, her voice cracking in terror. Ryder didn't raise his voice. He simply tilted his head, a terrifyingly calm gesture. Ethan stepped forward and slammed a thick manila folder onto the desk. "Bank records, offshore routing numbers, and security footage of your husband meeting with Yuri Volkov. We know everything, Agatha." "My husband! He handled the finances! I had no idea!" She was weeping now, a stark contrast to the cruel woman who had berated Penny just 30 minutes prior. "Your husband," Ryder said coldly, "is currently in the trunk of a very uncomfortable car at the bottom of the Chicago River. And since he used this building as collateral to guarantee the Russians their cut, this property now belongs to me." Penny's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't understand all the words. Bratva, collateral, offshore. But she understood the danger radiating from the man in the dark coat. He was a monster, a real-life monster, straight out of the scary stories the older kids told after lights out. "You're taking the orphanage?" Mrs. Higgins gasped. "You can't. Where will the children go? I don't care about the children, Ryder stated, his voice devoid of a single ounce of empathy. The state can have them. I want this building cleared out by midnight, or I'll burn it down with your belongings inside. Sign the deed transfer. Ethan clicked a pen and tossed it onto the desk. In the closet, Penny was shaking so violently that she bumped against a heavy brass umbrella stand. Clatter. The noise was minuscule, but to men trained to hear a safety click from across a room, it was a siren. Instantly, Ryder paused. Ethan and another bodyguard turned towards the hallway, weapons drawn in a flash of blued steel. "We have a rat," Ethan murmured, stepping out of the office and aiming his gun squarely at the louvered doors of the coat closet. Penny squeezed her eyes shut. "Please," she prayed to anyone who would listen. "Please make me invisible." "Open it," Ryder commanded, stepping out into the hallway, his eyes locked on the closet. Ethan reached out, grabbed the brass handle, and yanked the doors wide open. Penny screamed, a tiny, high-pitched sound of absolute terror, and scrambled backward until her back hit the plaster wall of the closet. She curled into a tight ball, holding her rabbit like a shield over her head, waiting for the gunfire, waiting for the monster to strike her. But the gunshot never came. Instead, the suffocating silence returned. Ethan slowly lowered his weapon, looking thoroughly bewildered. He glanced back at his boss. "It's a kid, Ryder." Ryder stepped forward, his massive frame blocking out the light from the hallway. He looked down into the dusty closet. There, huddled among the hems of winter coats, was the smallest, most pathetic creature he had ever seen. She was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering, her large grey eyes wide, with a fear so pure it made Ryder's stomach inexplicably tighten. He had seen fear before. He thrived on it. He commanded it. But the terror in this child's eyes wasn't just fear of a gun. It was the hollow, exhausted fear of a creature that had been beaten down by the world since the day she was born. "What are you doing in there?" Ryder asked. His voice, usually a weapon, involuntarily softened around the edges. Penny slowly lowered the rabbit. She looked at the giant of a man, taking in his sharp jaw, the dark stubble, the expensive coat, and the cold blue eyes. She didn't see the Mafia boss. In her exhausted, grief-stricken 7-year-old brain, she only saw a man in a suit who had come to the orphanage on gala day. She swallowed hard, her stutter returning in full force. "Aha! Are you here to pick me?" Ethan choked on a breath. Behind them, Mrs. Higgins gasped. Ryder froze. The question hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Pick you?" he repeated, his brow furrowing in confusion. For adoption," Penny whispered, a fresh tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "Nobody picked me today. They took Tommy, and Sarah, but nobody picked me. I promise I can be good. I know I'm small, but I can scrub floors really fast." Something fractured inside Ryder Blackwell's chest. A man who had ordered executions without blinking, a man who had built an empire on blood and concrete, felt a sudden, violent surge of protective rage that entirely blinded him. He looked at her scuffed, undersized shoes. He looked at the bruised knees. He looked at the way she instinctively flinched when he shifted his weight. "Mr. Blackwell, please excuse her," Mrs. Higgins babbled nervously, stepping out of her office. "She's a disturbed child. Penelope is severely traumatized, completely unadoptable. Damaged goods, really. I'll have her sent to the basement immediately." Before the director could finish her sentence, Ryder moved. In a blur of motion, he had Mrs. Higgins pinned against the wall by her throat, his forearm pressing against her windpipe. The bodyguards didn't flinch, but Mrs. Higgins let out a strangled, terrified wheeze. "Say one more word about her," Ryder whispered, his face inches from the director's, "and I will cut out your tongue and feed it to the stray dogs in the alley. Nod if you understand." Mrs. Higgins nodded frantically, her face turning purple. Ryder dropped her, disgusted. He turned back to the closet and slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee, ruining the crease of his $1,000 trousers on the dusty floorboards. He was now eye level with Penny. "What is your name, Piccola?" he asked softly. Penny," she stuttered. Ryder held out a massive, calloused hand. He didn't rush her. He waited. "My name is Ryder. I'm taking you out of this place, Penny. But you have to take my hand." Ethan stepped forward, panic in his eyes. "Ryder, boss, what are you doing? We aren't a charity. We run a syndicate. You can't take a kid." "I just did," Ryder said without looking away from Penny. "Ethan, get the guardianship transfer papers out of that woman's desk. Force her to sign them. Not as a ward of the state. She signs Penelope over to me. Permanently." "Ryder, the legalities. I own the judges in this city, Ethan. Make it happen," Ryder barked, before turning his attention back to the trembling girl. His gaze softened instantly. "No one is going to leave you behind again, Penny. I swear it on my life." Penny looked at his outstretched hand. It was large enough to crush hers. But as she looked into his icy blue eyes, she didn't see the monster anymore. She saw an anchor in a storm. Slowly, tentatively, her tiny fingers reached out and placed themselves in his palm. Ryder's hand closed gently around hers, enveloping it completely in warmth. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly into his arms as if she weighed no more than a feather. Penny gasped, instinctively burying her face into the crook of his neck, her tiny arms wrapping around his broad shoulders. The most feared man in Chicago turned on his heel, carrying the forgotten orphan out of the darkness and into a world she couldn't possibly comprehend. The ride to the Blackwell estate in Winnetka was done in absolute silence. The interior of the armored SUV was cavernous, smelling of rich leather and expensive cologne. Penny sat buckled securely in the back seat, practically swallowed by the massive captain's chair. She kept her eyes glued to the window, watching the snowy, neon-lit streets of Chicago blur into the sprawling, tree-lined avenues of the ultra-wealthy suburbs. Ryder sat across from her, his long legs stretched out, an open laptop resting on his knees. Yet his eyes rarely left the screen. They were fixed on the small girl shivering, despite the car's heater. He had no idea what he had just done. He was a 34-year-old crime boss with enemies lurking in every shadow. His life was bullets, betrayals, and blood money. Bringing a 7-year-old child into his world wasn't just irresponsible. It was a staggering vulnerability. But every time he thought about sending her to a proper boarding school or finding her a legitimate family, he remembered the terrifying look of resignation in her grey eyes when she had asked if he was there to pick her. He couldn't let her go. The decision defied all logic. But Ryder Blackwell hadn't survived the underworld by ignoring his instincts. She belonged with him now. The SUV pulled through a set of massive, wrought-iron security gates, driving up a long, snow-covered driveway until it stopped in front of a sprawling, Gothic-style stone mansion. It looked like a castle. To Penny, it looked like something out of a fairy tale, but much darker and infinitely more intimidating. As the car doors opened, the frigid wind howled. Ryder didn't wait for his men. He reached in, unbuckled Penny, and lifted her into his arms, shielding her small body from the wind with the lapels of his heavy wool coat. He carried her up the front steps and through the grand double doors. The foyer was a masterpiece of black marble, sweeping staircases and antique chandeliers. Waiting in the center of the hall was Martha Gable, Ryder's longtime housekeeper. She was a stern, practical woman in her 60s who had patched up gunshot wounds and cleaned blood off carpets without ever asking questions. But when Ryder walked in carrying a tiny, terrified child clutching a ragged stuffed animal, Martha's jaw physically dropped. "Mr. Blackwell," Martha breathed, wiping her hands on her apron. "What on earth? What is this?" "This is Penelope," Ryder announced, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "She lives here now. She is my ward." A heavy silence descended on the foyer. Jackson, the head of estate security, stepped out of the shadows, a submachine gun slung over his shoulder, staring at the child as if she were an alien species. "Sir," Jackson started cautiously, "we have the Castellano crew moving on our southern ports. We are on high alert. This is not a safe environment for a—" "Do you think I don't know the state of my own empire, Jackson?" Ryder's voice was dangerously low. He turned his chilling gaze to the security chief. "Double the perimeter guard. Triple the men at the gates. No one comes within a mile of this property without my authorization. If anyone asks, she is under my absolute protection. Anyone who looks at her wrong answers to me." He turned back to Martha. "Get a guest suite ready, the one next to my master bedroom. Buy clothes, toys, whatever a 7-year-old needs. Have a pediatrician here by tomorrow morning to give her a full checkup." "Yes, Mr. Blackwell," Martha said, her professional demeanor snapping back into place, though her eyes softened as she looked at Penny. "Hello, Penelope. I'm Mrs. Gable. Are you hungry, dear?" Penny, still clinging to Ryder's neck, peeked out and gave a microscopic nod. "I'll have the chef make some macaroni and cheese. Come with me, sweetheart." Martha reached out to take the child, but as the housekeeper's hands approached, Penny let out a whimper and tightened her grip on Ryder like a vice, burying her face deeper into his collar. The sudden panic in the girl was palpable. She didn't know this woman. She only knew that the giant man holding her was the one who had taken her away from Mrs. Higgins. Ryder was momentarily paralyzed. He wasn't a man who provided comfort. He broke bones. He didn't mend them. Yet, feeling her tiny heartbeat racing against his chest, a strange, fierce instinct took over. He awkwardly placed a large hand on her back, rubbing slow, steady circles. "It's okay," Ryder murmured, a sound so gentle that Jackson and Ethan exchanged bewildered glances. "You don't have to go with her. I'll carry you to the kitchen." Later that night, the reality of the situation truly settled in. Penny had been bathed by Mrs. Gable and dressed in a silk nightgown that was easily 4 sizes too big, meant for a teenager. She was placed in a massive 4-poster bed in a room that was larger than the entire dormitory at St. Jude, Rel. But the grandeur didn't bring her peace. It brought agoraphobia. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched out like claws, and the unfamiliar silence of the mansion was deafening compared to the constant coughing and crying of the orphanage. At 2 a.m., a sudden, violent crack of thunder rattled the heavy window panes. A winter storm was raging outside. Penny shot up in bed, gasping for air. In her half-asleep panic, she forgot where she was. She thought she was back in the closet, waiting for Mrs. Higgins to drag her out by the hair. Trembling uncontrollably, she grabbed Barnaby the rabbit, slid off the towering mattress, and crept out of the bedroom. The hallway was dimly lit by wall sconces. She wandered aimlessly, a tiny ghost drifting through the corridors of a Mafia stronghold. She passed oil paintings and closed heavy oak doors, eventually noticing a sliver of golden light spilling from beneath a door at the end of the hall. She pushed it open silently. It was Ryder's private study. The room smelled of expensive scotch, tobacco, and gun oil. Ryder was sitting behind a massive desk, his sleeves rolled up, revealing intricate, dark tattoos climbing up his forearms. Spread across the desk were blueprints of the Chicago docks, stacks of banded $100 bills, and a disassembled Glock pistol that he was methodically cleaning. He was in his element, calculating, lethal, surrounded by the tools of his bloody trade. He heard the floorboard creak before she even stepped fully into the room. In a fraction of a second, Ryder's hand snatched the slide of the pistol, snapping it into place, and he aimed directly at the door. Penny froze in the doorway, her eyes wide as saucers, staring down the barrel of the gun. When Ryder registered who it was, he dropped the weapon onto the desk as if it burned him, a rare flash of genuine horror crossing his face. He cursed violently under his breath in Italian, running a hand over his tired face. "Penny," he exhaled, pushing his chair back. "You shouldn't sneak up on people in this house. It's not safe." She stood rooted to the spot, hugging her rabbit, her bottom lip quivering. I got scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind howling outside. "The thunder was loud, and it's too big in there. The shadows are looking at me." Ryder looked at the money, the gun, and the maps of his illicit empire. Then he looked at the fragile child in the oversized nightgown, standing barefoot on his Persian rug. He didn't know how to be a father. He barely knew how to be a human being most days, but he knew how to be a protector. He stood up, walked around the desk, and knelt in front of her. He didn't tell her that monsters didn't exist in the shadows. He knew better than anyone that they did. "Are you scared of the dark?" he asked quietly. Penny nodded tearfully. Ryder scooped her up into his arms. He walked her over to a large, plush leather Chesterfield sofa by the fireplace. He sat down, settling her securely in his lap. The fire crackled, casting a warm orange glow over them. "You don't have to be scared of the dark anymore, Penny," Ryder said, his deep voice rumbling in his chest, vibrating against her cheek. "Do you know why?" She looked up at him, her tear-stained eyes reflecting the firelight. "Why?" Ryder's gaze hardened into something unbreakable, something ancient and terrifyingly devoted. "Because the monsters that live in the dark are terrified of me. And as long as you are with me, nothing in this world will ever be allowed to hurt you again." Penny rested her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. For the first time in her life, the smell of bleach and cabbage was gone, replaced by the scent of wood smoke and safety. As she finally closed her eyes and drifted into a dreamless sleep in the arms of Chicago's most feared crime boss, Ryder Blackwell stared into the fire, knowing his life of ruthless isolation was over. The unthinkable had happened. He had found a heart, and it was currently holding a one-eared rabbit. 3 months had passed since the blizzard that brought Penelope to the Blackwell estate in Winnetka. In that time, the sprawling stone mansion had undergone a bizarre metamorphosis. The cold, calculating epicenter of Chicago's most ruthless crime syndicate now featured a designated playroom on the 2nd floor, complete with pastel-colored walls and a towering dollhouse. The heavily armed men patrolling the perimeter had learned to soften their scowls, and it wasn't entirely uncommon to see Jackson, the hardened head of security, carefully stepping over scattered crayons in the hallway. Penny was slowly coming back to life, like a starved flower finally placed in the sun. Her cheeks had filled out thanks to Martha's relentless stream of homemade pastries, and her haunted grey eyes now held sparks of genuine curiosity. Yet, the trauma of St. Jude's and the deep-seated fear of abandonment still lingered. She rarely strayed far from Ryder, trailing behind him like a tiny, silent shadow whenever he was in the house. For Ryder Blackwell, the shift was absolute. The man who dictated the flow of illegal firearms, narcotics, and extortion across the Midwest found himself rescheduling sit-downs with dangerous capos so he wouldn't miss Penny's bedtime. He had become fiercely, violently protective of her. To the outside world, he was still a monster. But to Penny, he was the immovable wall standing between her and the nightmares. However, in the underworld, perceived softness was an invitation to slaughter. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Ryder was holding a high-level briefing in the dining room, the mahogany table covered in shipping manifests from the Navy Pier docks. Around the table sat his top lieutenants, a collection of dangerous men who commanded the streets of Chicago. Among them was Vincent Russell, an ambitious and ruthless capo who managed the South Side rackets. "The Castellano family is testing our borders near Englewood," Vincent stated, tapping a gold pen against the table. "And Yuri Volkov hasn't forgotten about the 3 million you burned when you seized the orphanage, Ryder. The Bratva is restructuring. They're getting bold. We need to hit them hard. Send a message before they think we're bleeding out." Ryder leaned back in his chair, his icy blue eyes fixed on Vincent. "Volkov is a scavenger. Let him dig through the scraps. If he steps 1 foot into the loop, I'll have his head mailed back to Moscow. Until then, hold the line. No unprovoked wars." Vincent's jaw tightened. "With respect, boss, the men are talking. They say you're distracted, that you spend more time playing house with that stray kid than running the streets. You're leaving us vulnerable." The temperature in the room plummeted. Ethan, standing by the door, instinctively rested his hand on his sidearm. Ryder didn't shout. He didn't even blink. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, the air around him crackling with a sudden, lethal energy. "Vincent," Ryder whispered, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a straight razor, "if you ever refer to my daughter as a stray again, I will personally carve your tongue out and make you swallow it. My focus is exactly where it needs to be. Do you understand me?" Vincent swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. "Yes, Ryder. Understood." Before the tension could break, the heavy oak doors of the dining room creaked open. The lieutenants tensed, turning to see Penny standing in the doorway. She was wearing a pair of denim overalls and holding a piece of drawing paper, her stuffed rabbit, Barnaby, tucked firmly under her arm. She froze when she saw the room full of imposing, scarred men, her eyes widening in immediate panic. I'm sorry," she stuttered, taking a quick step backward, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the doorframe. "I didn't know. I'll go back to my R-room." The terrifying aura surrounding Ryder vanished instantly. He stood up, ignoring the bewildered stares of his kapos, and walked over to her. He knelt right there in his tailored suit, completely indifferent to the ruthless men watching him. "It's all right, Piccola," Ryder said softly, brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "You don't have to hide. What do you have there?" Penny hesitated, then timidly held out the paper. It was a crude crayon drawing of a large, dark figure holding hands with a tiny figure, standing outside a big grey house. "I drew us," she whispered. Ryder took the paper, his chest tightening with an emotion he still didn't have a name for. He looked at the drawing, then back at her, offering a rare, genuine smile. "It's a masterpiece. I'll put it on my desk." He gently tapped her nose. "Go find Mrs. Gable in the kitchen. Tell her I said you can have a cookie before dinner." Penny's face lit up with a small, fragile smile. "Okay." She turned and scampered down the hall. Ryder watched her go, his expression softening until she was out of sight. When he stood and turned back to the table, the indulgent father was gone. The Mafia boss had returned, his eyes colder and more dead than before. "The meeting is over," Ryder commanded. "Hold the borders. I'm taking Penny to the Lincoln Park Conservatory tomorrow. I want the perimeter secured by advance teams. Ethan, you're with me." As the men filed out, Vincent lingered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a dark, calculating resentment, before he turned and disappeared into the rain. The Lincoln Park Conservatory was a lush, humid oasis of exotic orchids, towering ferns, and winding glass pathways. To Ryder, it was a logistical nightmare, with too many lines of sight, but he had rented out the entire facility for the afternoon. He wanted Penny to see the butterflies. He wanted her to experience something beautiful that didn't come with a price tag of fear. Penny was completely captivated. She walked a few steps ahead of Ryder, her head tilted back as she watched a massive blue morpho butterfly flutter near the glass ceiling. She was wearing a yellow sundress that Mrs. Gable had picked out, looking every bit like a normal, happy child. Ryder watched her from a few feet away, his hands resting in the pockets of his dark slacks. For a fleeting second, listening to the gentle trickling of the indoor waterfalls, he let himself imagine a life where this was his only reality. A life without blood money, without the syndicate, without constantly checking the exits. "Boss," Ethan murmured, stepping up beside him, his earpiece glowing faintly. Jackson's advance team checked in. "South entrance is locked down. We have the place entirely to ourselves." "Keep the perimeter tight," Ryder replied, his eyes tracking Penny as she bent down to inspect a bright pink orchid. "She's happy, Ethan. Look at her. A few months ago, she wouldn't even speak above a whisper. You did a good thing, Ryder. Maybe the only truly good thing we've ever done. "Papa, look!" Penny suddenly called out, pointing a tiny finger at a cluster of vibrant lilies. The word Papa struck Ryder with the force of a physical blow. She had never called him that before. It was a tentative offering, a profound declaration of absolute trust. He took a breath, a warm smile touching his lips as he stepped toward her. "I see them, Penny." Crack. The sound of silenced gunfire shattering tempered glass is distinct. A sharp, hissing snap, followed by the rain of falling shards. Before Ryder's brain could even process the threat, his instincts violently took over. He lunged forward with explosive speed, tackling Penny to the stone floor just as a high-caliber bullet embedded itself into the limestone planter where she had been standing a microsecond before. "Down!" Ethan roared, drawing his weapon and firing blindly towards the catwalks above the conservatory. Chaos erupted in paradise, the humid air filled with the deafening cracks of gunfire, the screams of shattering glass, and the visceral scent of pulverized stone and cordite. Penny screamed, a raw, pure sound of absolute terror that ripped Ryder's soul to shreds. I've got you," Ryder practically snarled, covering her small, trembling body completely with his massive frame. He shielded her head with his hands, feeling her tears hot against his skin. She was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching Barnaby the rabbit as if her life depended on it. "3 shooters! East Catwalk!" Ethan yelled over the din, returning fire. Ryder drew his own weapon, his icy blue eyes turning black with a murderous, unholy rage. Someone had brought a war to his daughter. Someone had dared to point a gun at the only pure thing in his desolate life. "Ethan, cover fire!" Ryder commanded. As Ethan unleashed a volley of bullets, Ryder scooped Penny into his arms, pressing her face into his chest so she wouldn't see the violence. "Close your eyes, Penny. Do not open them until I tell you." He sprinted through the dense foliage, moving with terrifying agility for a man of his size. Bullets whizzed past them, tearing through the exotic plants and pinging off the metal framing of the greenhouse. Ryder wasn't running away. He was flanking. He moved through the heavy ferns, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He saw a shadow moving on the catwalk above the orchid display. Without slowing down, Ryder raised his weapon with one hand, while holding Penny tight with the other, and fired twice. A heavy body plummeted from the catwalk, crashing through the glass exhibits and landing lifelessly on the stone path. "Papa!" Penny shrieked, burying her face deeper into his shirt, trembling violently. "I'm here. You're safe," he breathed, continuing to move. Jackson and the outside security team finally breached the doors, heavily armed and shouting tactical commands. The remaining 2 assassins, realizing they were outgunned, tried to flee through the service exit. Jackson's men cut them down in a hail of gunfire before they made it 10 feet. The conservatory fell silent, save for the sound of dripping water from severed irrigation pipes and Penny's frantic, hyperventilating sobs. Ryder dropped to his knees behind a heavy stone fountain, leaning his back against the cold concrete. He pulled Penny into his lap, wrapping both arms securely around her. "It's over," he whispered fiercely, pressing kisses into her dark hair. "It's over, Piccola. I have you. They're gone." Ethan jogged over, his suit covered in dust and glass fragments, his weapon still drawn. He looked at the dead men scattered among the flowers. "Russians," he spat, checking the pulse of the assassin Ryder had shot. "Bratva hit us. Yuri Volkov sent them." Ryder's jaw clenched so hard his teeth threatened to crack. He gently rocked Penny, trying to soothe her erratic breathing. "How did they know we were here, Ethan? This was a private rental, off the books. Only the inner circle knew about this location." Ethan froze, the realization dawning on him. He knelt down beside the dead assassin and began rummaging through his pockets. He pulled out an encrypted burner phone. The screen was cracked, but it was still operational. Ethan tapped the screen and looked at the last received message. His face went pale. He held the phone out to Ryder. The text read, The Lincoln Park Conservatory. He has the girl with him. He's unprotected. Do it now. Vincent, Ryder whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. His own capo. One of his most trusted men had sold him out to the Russians because he thought Ryder had grown weak. Vincent had placed a target on a 7-year-old girl just to seize power. Penny looked up at Ryder, her face stained with tears, her grey eyes wide with lingering terror. Are they going to take me away again? She stuttered, her tiny hands gripping his lapels. Did I do something bad? The innocence of her question broke the final chain holding back the monster inside Ryder Blackwell. He looked down at her, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek with a remarkably gentle thumb. No, sweetheart, Ryder said, his voice terrifyingly calm, a direct contrast to the slaughterhouse his mind had just become. You did nothing wrong. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and no one is ever taking you away. He stood up, holding her securely against his chest, and looked at Ethan over the bodies of the fallen assassins. The look in Ryder's eyes was one of pure, apocalyptic destruction. The protective father was gone, entirely consumed by the merciless syndicate king. Take us back to the estate. Lock it down, Ryder commanded, his voice echoing through the shattered glass house. Then gather the men. Call every loyal gun in the city. What are we doing, boss? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Ryder looked down at the burner phone, then out towards the Chicago skyline, visible through the broken roof. We're going to war, Ryder stated coldly. I'm going to burn the Bratva to the ground, and I'm going to rip Vincent Russell's heart out of his chest while it's still beating. By sunrise, everyone in this city will know exactly what happens when you threaten my daughter. The Blackwell estate was transformed into an impenetrable fortress within the hour. Floodlights illuminated the sprawling, snow-covered grounds, and heavily armed men patrolled the perimeter with K9 units. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Ryder carried Penny straight up to her bedroom, bypassing the frantic tactical preparations happening in the foyer. He set her down gently on the edge of her massive bed. She was still clutching Barnaby, her small knuckles entirely white, her grey eyes staring blankly at the wall. The trauma of the conservatory had forced her mind to retreat into a protective shell. "Penny," Ryder said softly, crouching in front of her. He reached out, his large, calloused hands enveloping hers. "Look at me, Piccola." Slowly, her gaze shifted to his face. "I have to go out for a little while," he told her, his voice steady and grounding. "Mrs. Gable is going to sit right here with you. Jackson and 20 of my best men are standing right outside your door. The safest place in the entire world tonight is this room." Are you going to punish them?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The bad men?" Ryder's icy blue eyes darkened, the lethal syndicate boss surfacing through the veneer of the gentle father. "Yes, I am going to make sure that no one ever looks at you with a weapon again." He kissed her forehead, lingering for a second to memorize the feeling of her absolute trust. "I will be back before you wake up, I promise." When Ryder walked down the grand staircase, he was no longer a father. He was the devil himself. He had traded his tailored suit for black tactical gear, a Kevlar vest, and an array of weaponry that made him look like a one-man army. In the foyer, Ethan and 30 of the syndicate's most ruthless enforcers stood waiting, faces painted with grim determination. "Vincent Russell is holding up at the old meatpacking plant over in the Fulton Market district," Ethan reported, racking the slide of his assault rifle. "He's got about 40 men with him. Yuri Volkov is at his penthouse on Wacker Drive, celebrating what he thinks is a successful hit." "Split the teams," Ryder commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that echoed off the marble walls. "Ethan, you take Team 2. Breach Volkov's penthouse. I don't want him arrested. I don't want him questioned. I want him thrown off his own balcony. Make it look like a tragic Russian accident." "And Russell?" Ethan asked. "Russell is mine," Ryder stated flatly. "No one touches him but me." The convoy of matte black SUVs rolled out of Winnetka like a funeral procession, bringing death to the streets of Chicago. The city, oblivious to the underground war, sparkled under the winter night. But in the shadows of the Fulton Market, blood was about to spill. Ryder's assault on Vincent's stronghold wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. They breached the heavy steel doors of the warehouse with C4 explosives, the concussive blast shattering the windows of neighboring buildings. Before the smoke even cleared, Ryder was moving through the debris. He was a phantom of violence, his weapon an extension of his own wrath. Vincent's men, hardened criminals who had survived years on the streets, broke ranks and ran when they saw the look in Ryder's eyes. He didn't just shoot to kill. He moved with a mechanical, predatory precision that offered zero quarter. He fought his way through the chilling labyrinth of hanging meat hooks and industrial freezers, leaving a trail of shattered bodies in his wake. Finally, he reached the back office. He kicked the door off its hinges. Vincent Russell was scrambling towards the fire escape, a duffel bag full of cash clutched in his hands. He froze as Ryder stepped into the room, the barrel of Ryder's weapon aimed directly at his chest. "Ryder, wait!" Vincent screamed, dropping the bag. The money spilled across the blood-stained concrete. It was business, just business. Volkov promised me the Southside ports. You were getting soft, Ryder. You brought a liability into the family. Ryder didn't say a word. He walked forward slowly, the silence in the room deafening compared to the ringing in Vincent's ears. "I've served you for 10 years, Vincent babbled, backing up until he hit the brick wall, sweat pouring down his face. "You're going to kill me over a stray kid from an orphanage? She isn't even your blood." Ryder stopped 3 feet away. He lowered his rifle, letting it hang by its tactical sling. Then, in a blindingly fast motion, he drew his heavy combat knife. "She is my daughter," Ryder whispered, the words dripping with absolute, lethal certainty. "And you pointed a gun at her." Vincent lunged in a desperate bid for survival, but he was painfully outmatched. Ryder deflected the sloppy punch, driving his knee into Vincent's stomach before spinning him around and slamming him face first into the brick wall. "You wanted to take my heart, Vincent," Ryder hissed in his ear, his grip like a steel vice, "so I'm taking yours." The scream that echoed out of the Fulton Market warehouse that night became a legendary cautionary tale in the Chicago underworld. By 3 a.m., the Bratva's operations in the city were entirely dismantled. Yuri Volkov had taken a fatal 70-story plunge onto Wacker Drive, and Vincent Russell's lifeless body was left strung up on a meat hook as a gruesome monument to Ryder Blackwell's wrath. The message sent to the 5 families, the cartels, and the street gangs was universally understood. The King of Chicago was not soft. He was more dangerous than ever, and the little girl holding the stuffed rabbit was entirely untouchable. Dawn was breaking over Lake Michigan, casting a soft, golden, pinkish hue across the horizon when Ryder finally returned to the Winnetka estate. The house was dead quiet. He walked straight to the master bathroom, stripping off the tactical gear and throwing his blood-spattered clothes into the incinerator chute. He stood under the scalding hot spray of the shower for nearly an hour, methodically scrubbing his skin with heavy lava soap until it was raw and red. He watched the water swirl down the drain, taking the physical remnants of the monster away, praying that the violence of the night wouldn't somehow infect the pure air of his home. When he finally stepped out, dressed in a clean, soft cashmere sweater and dark sweat pants, he looked completely exhausted. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the heavy, crushing weight of his reality. He walked silently down the hall and slowly pushed open the door to Penny's room. Mrs. Gable was asleep in a comfortable armchair in the corner, a knitted blanket pulled over her lap. But Penny was awake. She was sitting up in the middle of her massive bed, surrounded by pillows, tracing the stitching on Barnaby's remaining ear. When she heard the door creak, her head snapped up. Seeing Ryder standing there, safe and whole, the fear instantly evaporated from her tiny face. She threw the covers off, scrambled to the edge of the bed, and launched herself into his arms before he could even brace himself. Ryder caught her smoothly, burying his face into her shoulder, closing his eyes tightly. He breathed in the scent of her lavender shampoo, a stark, beautiful contrast to the copper and cordite that had filled his lungs just hours ago. "You came back," she whispered against his neck. "I told you I would," he murmured, carrying her over to the large bay window that overlooked the snow-covered gardens. He sat down on the cushioned window seat, settling her comfortably in his lap as the morning sun spilled over them. "The bad men are gone, Penny. They are never coming back. You'll never have to look over your shoulder again." Penny rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I was scared," she admitted quietly. "But then I remembered what you said about the monsters in the dark." Ryder smiled faintly, his thumb gently stroking her arm. "Good." He reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He had called in every favor, bribed 3 city officials, and physically threatened a state senator to expedite the process in record time. He handed the heavy parchment paper to her. "What is it?" she asked, looking at the complex legal jargon, the gold seals, and the bold signature of Honorable Judge William T. Montgomery at the bottom. "When I took you from St. Jude's, I told you that you were mine," Ryder explained, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. "But I wanted the whole world to know it. I wanted it to be real, permanent, and entirely unbreakable." Penny looked down at the paper. She was smart for her age, her eyes scanning the bolded letters near the top. "Certificate of Finalized Adoption." "It means," Ryder continued, his voice cracking slightly, "that you aren't an orphan anymore. It means you are not a guest in this house. You are my daughter. Forever." Penny's breath hitched, her wide, grey eyes filled with fresh tears. But this time, they weren't born of terror or abandonment. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She looked at the blank line at the bottom of the page, meant for the child's newly, legally recognized name. Ryder pulled a silver pen from his pocket and handed it to her. "Do you know how to write your new name, Piccola?" Penny took the pen with trembling fingers. She pressed it to the paper and, with careful, deliberate strokes, she wrote, "Penelope Blackwell." She stared at the letters for a long time, letting the reality of the ink sink into her soul. She belonged to someone. She was chosen. She dropped the pen, wrapped her arms tightly around Ryder's neck, and buried her face against his collarbone, crying softly into his sweater. "Thank you, Papa. Thank you for picking me." Ryder wrapped his arms around her, holding her tighter than he had ever held anything in his life. He looked out the window at the rising sun, feeling the last cold remnants of his isolated, ruthless heart melt away completely. "No, Penny," he whispered into her hair. "You picked me." The terrifying legacy of Ryder Blackwell was forever altered not by the bullets he fired or the empires he dismantled, but by a stuttering 7-year-old girl with a one-eared rabbit. In the unforgiving world of the Chicago Syndicate, where power was measured in blood and fear, Ryder found his true strength in the fragile, unconditional love of his adopted daughter. The monster the underworld feared became the shield Penelope desperately needed, while she, in turn, became the light that guided him out of the darkness. Their bond proved that even the most hardened, violent souls are capable of profound redemption when given a reason to care. "Nobody picked me," she had once trembled in the cold halls of an orphanage. But in the end, the most dangerous man in the city didn't just pick her. He moved heaven, earth, and the entire criminal underworld to give her a home.